This is our lecture on Chinese Tang and Song poetry. And for this poetry, what I will do in the lecture here is build a context, a kind of window through which to perceive the poetry and appreciate it. I think that best context for appreciating this work, this poetry, was established in the mid 20th century. And so we're going to revisit some voices from the mid 20th century in the United States, mid 20th century US literary situation, and situate this poetry within that culture and context when, which was a time, mid 20th century poetry, when there was an explosion of this Tong poetry into the consciousness of many readers, in particular young people in the United States. And we're going to take a look at the reasons for that, the motivations for that fascination, that mid 20th century fascination with this poetry, and then establish a link between the reasons for that fascination then and our own situation today, which I don't think is fundamentally different. That is, I think we can take our cue for framing and appreciating this poetry from that phenomenon in the mid 20th century. To be appreciated by US American readers, of course, by most US American readers anyway, these poems had to be translated. So translating the poems was one way in which these devotees of this poetry applied their talents and abilities in order to share the poetry with an American reading audience. One of the most famous, best-known translators of the so-called Cold Mountain poems by Han Shan was Gary Snyder. He's got a couple of translations in our posted text. If you go to the text of the poetry itself, and you go to 987, this is one translated by him. And ask the way to Cold Mountain. Cold Mountain, there's no through trail. In summer, ice doesn't melt. Rising sun blurs in swirling fog. How did I make it? My heart's not the same as yours. If your heart was like mine, you'd get it and be right here. Now, as it happens, Snyder's efforts in translating these poems were actually dramatized in a popular novel of the 1950s. This is the title page, Jack Kerouac's The Dharma Bums, published 1958. If you look at the original copy right there, and the book is dedicated this book to Han Shan. This is a passage from relatively early in the book. Kerouac casts himself in the first person here as a character named Ray, and he renames Gary Snyder, our translator, as Jaffe Ryder in this book. The setting is in California. Excuse me, it's California. I think somewhere in San Francisco area. Peacefuler scene I never saw then than when, in that rather nippy late red afternoon, I simply opened his little door and looked in and saw him at the end of the little shack, sitting cross-legged on a paisley pillow on a straw mat, with his spectacles on, making him look old and scholarly and wise, with book on lap and the little tin teapot and porcelain cup steaming at his side. He looked up very peacefully, saw who it was, said, "Ray, come in," and bent his eyes again to the script. "What are you doing?" "Translating Han Shan's great poem called Cold Mountain, written 1,000 years ago, some of it scribbled on the sides of cliffs, hundreds of miles away from any other living beings." "Wow." "When you come into this house, though, you've got to take your shoes off. See those straw mats? You can ruin them with shoes." So I took my soft-soled blue cloth shoes off and laid them dutifully by the door, and he threw me a pillow, and I sat cross-legged along the little wooden board wall, and he offered me a cup of hot tea. Talk about tea a little bit. And Snyder, aka Jaffe Ryder, asks him, "Want me to read you parts of this Han Shan poem? Want me to tell you about Han Shan?" "Yeah." Han Shan, you see, was a Chinese scholar who got sick of the big city and the world and took off to hide in the mountains. Yeah, yeah, sounds like you. Well, in those days, you could really do that. He stayed in caves not far from a Buddhist monastery in the Tongxing district of Tiandai, and his only human friend was the funny Zen lunatic Shite, who had a job sweeping out the monastery with a straw broom. Shite was a poet too, but he never wrote much down. Every now and then Han Shan would come down from Cold Mountain in his bark clothing and come into the warm kitchen and wait for food, but none of the monks would ever feed him because he didn't want to join the order and answer the meditation bell 3 times a day. You see why in some of his utterances, like, listen, and I'll look here and read from the Chinese. And I bent over his shoulder and watched him read from big wild crow tracks of Chinese signs. "Climbing up Cold Mountain Path goes on and on, long gorge choked with scree and boulders, wide creek and mist-blurred grass. Moss is slippery though there's been no rain. Pine sings, but there's no wind. Who can leap the world's ties and sit with me among white clouds?" Wow. Of course, that's my own translation into English. You see, there are 5 signs for each line, and I have to put in Western prepositions and articles and such. So why don't you just translate it as it is? 5 signs, 5 words. What's those first 5 signs? Signs for climbing, sign for up, sign for cold, sign for mountain, sign for path. Well, then translate it: climbing up Cold Mountain Path. Yeah, but what do you do with the sign for long, sign for gorge, sign for choke, sign for avalanche, sign for boulders? What is that? That's the third line. But I have to read long gorge, choke, avalanche, boulders. That's even better. Well, yeah, I thought of that, but I have to have this past approval of Chinese scholars here at the university and have it clear in English. "What a great thing this is," I said, looking around at the little shack. "And you sitting here so very quietly at this very quiet hour, studying all alone with your glasses. Right, what you gotta do is go climb a mountain with me, and soon. Now, how would you like to climb Matterhorn?" "Great, where's that?" Up in the high Sierras. We can go there with Henry Morley in his car, bring our packs, and take off from the lake. I could carry all the food and stuff we need in my rucksack, and you could borrow Alva's small backpack and carry extra socks and shoes and stuff. Now, what's these signs mean? Well, these signs mean that Anshan came down from the mountain after many years roaming around there to see his folks in town. Says, till recently I stayed at Cold Mountain, etc. Yesterday I called on friends and family. More than half had gone to the Yellow Springs. That means death, the Yellow Springs. Now morning I face my lone shadow. I can't study with both eyes full of tears. Oh, that's like you too, Jeffy. Studying with eyes full of tears. My eyes are full of tears. Oh, aren't they going to be after a long, long time? They certainly will, Ray. And look here, in the mountains it's cold. It's always been cold, not just this year. See, he's real high, maybe 12,000 or 13,000 feet or more, way up there. And he says, jagged scarps always snowed in, woods in the dark ravines, spitting mist, grass is still sprouting at the end of June, leaves begin falling in early August. And here I am, high as a junkie. A junkie? That's my own translation. He actually says, here I am high as the sensualist in the city below. But I made it modern in the high translation. Great. I wondered why Han Shan was Jaffe's hero. Because, said he was a poet, a mountain man, a Buddhist dedicated to the principle of meditation on the essence of all things, a vegetarian too, by the way, though I haven't got on that kick from figuring maybe in this modern world to be a vegetarian is to split hairs a little, since all sentient beings eat what they can. And he was a man of solitude who could take off by himself and live purely and true to himself. Well, I think this passage from a novel that today is largely forgotten, it's an autobiographical novel. A passage like this is really straight out of Kerouac and Kerouac's autobiography. Um, in other words, this pretty much really happened as described, but Kerouac would fictionalize his autobiographical passages such as this by changing the names. But it's a window into, I think, the sensibility and the motivations for the fascination that some of these Tang era poets had for a crucial cultural moment in the development of U.S. literature, but not just literature, but I think the U.S. Public mind really. Um, this book, Dharma Bums, would be a major influence in creating the counterculture of the 1960s. But what I think is really well illustrated here is the fact that Han Shan is a hero because he flees. He flees from a society that is deemed corrupt and and he flees from society into a primal wild nature. So this is a fundamental um, trajectory that characterizes literary sensibility and the creative imagination of writers in the Western tradition, particularly since the Romantic movement of about 1800, when you have that first celebration of nature as a refuge from a social environment, a society, an urban society that is industrializing and becoming a force of corruption and dehumanization, really, I think is a key concept here. The city, the cosmopolitan environment of these large urban centers that represent the pinnacle of major civilizations to these kinds of artists, both Han Shan and Gary Snyder, both Wong Wei and Jack Kerouac. In both cases, you're looking at an artistic sensibility that is alienated, a crucial word for us here in this lecture, alienated, becomes alienated from society and that feels that there's really that one must escape, one must take refuge in wild nature in order to maintain one's dignity and decency and even sanity as a human being. This is an impulse, a trajectory to retreat from the city, from the great urban centers of great civilizations, out to wild nature. This is a trajectory that defines this moment in poetry for a lot of these Tang poets, and also for the great romantic poets of the late 1700s and into the early 1800s, great period of romantic poetry, with William Blake, Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, Keats, and so on. Then has a flowering in the US American 19th century, 1800s environment with figures such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and, of course, Henry David Thoreau retreating to Walden Pond. And another major pushing of this impulse was with these beat poets, so-called beat poets, the beat movement of the 1950s, on into the 1960s with the counterculture and beyond. What motivates this impulse to flee, to retreat into nature? It's motivated by, as I say, an alienation, a sense of being alienated from one society. And the document posted called Hermits, Buddhists, and Taoists, I think, casts some light on how this alienation was perceived and experienced by the ancient Tang poets themselves. Let's look at this passage here. The new value placed on retreat from worldly entanglements even led to a reevaluation of the legacy of Confucius. With his famous saying, shine in a world that follows the way, but hide when the world loses the way. Confucius sometimes even urged his disciples to retreat from the world in times of political turmoil, and he himself was intrigued by eccentric hermits who had chosen to do so. Together, these developments turned the hermit into one of the most important figures of medieval China. Hermits, or followers of Aramatism, from the Greek word eremites, desert dweller, retreated from society because they disdained wealth, power, and fame, desired to preserve their inner nature and integrity, or wished to pursue spiritual and artistic aims. Their life was defined by the idea of a conscious choice of hermit life over other lifestyles, a sudden movement of revelation that convinces a person to make a radical life choice the value of renunciation and deprivation from the comforts of society, and the idea that life in seclusion is ultimately more natural than life in society, a return to rather than a departure from one's inner nature. So there's a sense that rather than reflect what's best and most essential to human flourishing, instead of doing that, what civilization is doing, what's happening in cities, what's happening in the institutions of power that create major empires, what's happening is a kind of corruption of what's best rather than an offering of human flourishing. And so that it's more natural, it's what that is, nature is what is intended. The idea of natural here is the idea of what's intended for human flourishing. You're going to find a better environment for intent what for living in a way that humans aren't designed to live if you flee out into nature and get away from the corruptions and toxicity of a twisted, decadent society. Now, why would that be felt by our poets at the time of the Tang dynasty? Well, there's some historical context offered here in our introductory material. During the medieval period, Eremitism entered a new phase. After the Han Dynasty, 206 BC to 220 CE, civil wars broke out. The subsequent period of disunion lasted for more than 3 centuries. Warlords established their own kingdoms. Non-Chinese invaders took over the traditional heartland of China in the north, and ill-fated dynasties rose and fell in quick succession. Making a life as a public official, our poets had to be trained in writing and letters, and you got that way by becoming a public official. That's how you got your literary training. Making a life as a public official, as elites during the Han Dynasty had aspired to do, was not just difficult but often lethal. The number of gifted writers and intellectuals who died young on the execution block because of volatile factional politics was remarkably high during this period, encouraging fresh waves of Eremitism. There's also the rise of Buddhism and Taoism, which sees a kind of, which prizes a inner pursuit of an inner spiritual light within oneself and a turning away from the corruptions of a world focused on bodily pleasures. A kind of ascetic, ASCETIC, ascetic impulse is working through both Buddhism and Taoism as they're developing in China at this time. And that too works to appeal to these poets who are fleeing from the great urban centers of culture. So we can understand then, by examining historical context, we can get some sense of what was driving the sense of alienation and the drive toward this flight into wild nature, or at least pastoral nature. What was going on with the Tang poets? But I wanted to build a bridge between then and now, and I think with this concept of alienation, we have a key insight that's quite useful, because if alienation was being experienced in a germinal and rather early form, arguably by some of these poets of the Tang dynasty. By the time you get to the time of the mid 20th century and our beat figures of the beat movement, you're looking at a society that is waking up to a particular, going through a kind of moment of self realization culturally, where a sense of just how alienating and alienated, just how alienating U.S. American culture is, and just how alienated the population, many members of the population are. This is part of the cultural history of the 1950s. Reading from a scholar here, the root meaning of alienation is man's loss of identity or selfhood through the breakdown of those relations that constitute and maintain personal identity. It is also to be noted that alienation is a term used primarily in descriptions of modern man. This is not to deny that many of the experiences, despair, loneliness, loss of belief, that many of these experiences were experienced by earlier generations, and in a sense, as we're seeing right here, in a way they were experienced way back at the time of the Tang Dynasty. But the emergence of the modern individual, the solitary human atom, together with a technical and mass society, has made alienation a critical modern problem. These two, individualism, these two phenomena, individualism and mass society, are peculiarly related in reference to alienation. Mass society tends to destroy traditional human groupings, such as the family, thus isolating individuals, and the alienated individual finds it impossible to appropriate meaningfully the culture maintained by mass society. Indeed, a vicious circle results, which for many can only be broken by revolt, rejection, and even a choice of estrangement as the basic mode of relating to the world. Now, one of the great diagnosticians of alienation in the American context in the 1950s was the social psychologist Erich Fromm, writing in The Sane Society from 1955. Consider this. We can speak of idolatry or alienation not only in relationship to other people, but also in relation to oneself. When the person is subject to irrational passions, the person who is mainly motivated by his lust for power does not experience himself anymore in the richness and limitlessness of a human being, but he becomes a slave to one partial striving in him, which is projected onto external aims by which he is possessed. The person who is given to the exclusive pursuit of his passion for money is possessed by his striving for it. Money is the ideal which he worships as the projection of one isolated power in himself, his greed for it. In this sense, the neurotic person is an alienated person. His actions are not his own. While he's under the illusion of doing what he wants, he's driven by forces which are separated from his self, which works behind his back. He's a stranger to himself, just as his fellow man is a stranger to him. He experiences the other and himself not as what they really are, but distorted by the unconscious forces which operate in them. The insane person is the absolutely alienated person. He has completely lost himself as the center of his own experience. He's lost the sense of self. Alienation, as we find it in modern society, is almost total. Man has created a world of man-made things as it never existed before. He has constructed a complicated social machine to administer the technical machine he built. Yet this whole creation of his stands over and above him. He does not feel himself as the creator and center, but as the servant of a golem, a sort of Frankenstein monster, the servant of a golem which his hands have built. The more powerful and gigantic the forces are which he unleashes, the more powerless he feels himself as a human being. He confronts himself with his own forces embodied in things he has created, alienated from himself. He is owned by his own creation and has lost ownership of himself. Well, you're saying, what does this have to do with the Tang poetry from so many hundreds of years ago? I'm building a context, a window through which we can appreciate the appeal of this poetry, appreciate the sensibility conveyed by this very old poetry. And I'm taking my model for the appreciation from the beat poets and the beat movement of the 1950s. And I'm saying, going to make the argument that the great appeal for this poetry was the vision it gave of a sensibility, a consciousness that healed the alienation that was being experienced by so many people, in particular young people, in the mid 20th century. That alienation was banished when they plunged themselves into Tang poetry from the 600s, 700s, 800s, this very old poetry from so far away and so long ago was like a cleansing flood for their consciousness. It washed the alienation away. And the alienation is perhaps best expressed by the greatest poem produced by the Beat movement, which is, of course, which has really become probably the most famous and signature poem produced by any poet in the entire 20th century, and that would have to be Howl by Allen Ginsberg. This is the voice of alienation. This is the expression of that alienation, which is diagnosed from a social psychological perspective by Erich Fromm in the passage I just read you. Here's how it feels to a poet who gets inside that alienation and writes from inside it, expressing it as it is subjectively experienced. And these are famous lines, of course. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. Recall Erich Fromm was just talking about madness as the extremist, most extreme form of alienation. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and machinery of night, to poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high, sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz, and so on. I won't go on. But I wanted to go down to a key passage where he characterizes the culture, US American society, from this perspective of someone who has awakened to just how alienated they are. As Fromm made clear in that passage I just read, most alienated people are not aware. They don't even feel their alienation. They are ignorant of it. It remains an unconscious part of their being. But what was happening, you see, with these beat writers and artists in the mid 20th century was they were realizing, waking up to their alienation, experiencing it, feeling it. Certainly, certainly, Ginsberg did. And here is his take on why it's happening. Part two of Howl, quite quite resonant and I think revealing passage. We'll just sample it here. All we're doing is sampling it. Sphinx of cement and aluminum bashed open their skulls and ate up their brains and imagination. This is the ancient, Ginsberg's writing out of an intense consciousness of the ancient Hebrew Old Testament prophets who denounced the corruptions of the ancient Israelites. And Moloch was one of the pagan gods to whom infamously the story has it that children were sacrificed. One of the ugliest, one of the ugliest pagan gods renounced by the ancient prophets. Moloch, solitude, filth, ugliness, ash cans, and unobtainable dollars, children screaming under the stairways, boys sobbing in armies, old men weeping in the parks. Nightmare of Moloch, Moloch the loveless, mental Moloch, Moloch the heavy judger of men, Moloch the incomprehensible prison, Moloch the crossbone soulless jailhouse and congress of sorrows, Moloch whose buildings are judgment, the vast stone of war, Moloch the stunned governments, Moloch whose mind is pure machinery, whose blood is running money, whose fingers are 10 armies, whose breast is a cannibal dynamo, whose ear is a smoking tomb, whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows, whose skyscrapers stand in the long streets like endless Jehovahs, whose factories dream and croak in the fog, whose smokestacks and antenna crown the cities, whose love is endless oil and stone, whose soul is electricity and banks, whose poverty is the specter of genius, whose fate is a cloud of sexless hydrogen, whose name is the mind, because alienation infects fundamentally the mind. Moloch becomes internalized inside oneself. How do you exorcise? How do you escape from it? Well, for Kerouac, for Gary Snyder, you escape from it by going to Cold Mountain. There's one translated by Burton Watson, who's one of the best translators of Hanshan. So Hanshan writes you these words which no one will believe. Honey is sweet, men love the taste. Medicine is bitter and hard to swallow. What soothes the feelings brings contentment. What opposes the will calls forth anger. Yet I ask you to look at the wooden puppets worn out by their moment of play on the stage. The challenge of this poem is to relate the final two lines to the preceding lines, I think. And what you realize is that in laying out the relationship between physical appetites and human reaction to the stimulus that appeals to those appetites, you realize that you're looking at a situation that is analogous to a puppet with its strings being pulled. If you pursue what gratifies your desire for what is sweet, then you are being driven by your basic physical appetite for sweetness. If you avoid whatever is bitter or hard to swallow simply because it's unpleasant, then you're letting that aversion to whatever is unpleasant to drive your behavior. If you pursue whatever soothes you and brings contentment, then you're letting your appetite for the soothing and the contenting and being contented to drive your behavior. And if you give in to anger, you're allowing whatever provokes your anger to drive your behavior. In those lines, 3, 4, 5, 6, there's a portrait of the human being as a puppet manipulated by the strings of its physical appetites and basic primal drives for satisfaction and aversion to discomfort. The human as puppet. But the human as puppet is a human that never really achieves or never achieves its own selfhood. You're always fleeing from yourself. And this poem is illuminated really effectively, I think, by that passage from Fromm. This is a vision of alienation that Hanshan is giving here. As Eric Fromm writes, the person who is given to the exclusive pursuit of his passion for money is possessed by his striving for it. Money is the idol which he worships as the projection of one isolated power in himself, his greed for it. In this sense, the neurotic person is an alienated person. As Fromm writes, the person who is motivated by his lust for power does not experience himself anymore in the richness and limitless of a human being, but he becomes a slave to one partial striving in him, which is projected into his external claims by which he is possessed. That's what Hanshan is getting at in this poem. To be in Cold Mountain is to be in a place where one triumphs over this kind of dehumanization, this alienation. It's a place where you can find your genuine self. High, high from the summit of the peak, whatever way I look, no limit in sight. No one knows I'm sitting here alone. A solitary moon shines in the cold spring. Here in the spring, this is not the moon. The moon is where it always is, in the sky above. And though I sing this one little song, in the song there is no Zen. What the speaker is repudiating here is representations of the real. He's disconnecting representations from the real thing as a way of discovering through a kind of mental discipline what is actually real. Songs are fine, but songs are representations. They're in language, there's actions of human expression. The actual Zen, the actual essence of reality, is not in representational expressions, just as it's not in the reflection of the moon in the pool of water that bubbles up from the spring next to which he is sitting. Just as the moon, as reflected in the water of the pool, is not the real moon, so the expression through song of his inner state of emotions is not his real self. It's a representation, it's an expression. Now, the importance of recognizing the difference from representations and reality may not seem to be all that significant point to make, but in fact, it's very important. Once again, I want to frame these poems, the appeal of these poems, the power of these poems. I want to look at it through the problem of alienation in contemporary society. Disaggregating, disconnecting mere representations from reality is crucial in a society such as ours, is it not? To a society in which we are profoundly alienated from ourselves. And here I'm going to read from one of our best public intellectuals, contemporary public intellectuals, Chris Hedges, in Empire of Illusion. Hour after hour, day after day, week after week, we are bombarded with the cant and spectacle pumped out over the airwaves or over computer screens by highly paid pundits, corporate advertisers, talk show hosts, and gossip-fueled entertainment networks. And a culture dominated by images and slogans seduces those who are functionally literate, but who make the choice not to read. There have been other historical periods with high rates of illiteracy and vast propaganda campaigns, but not since the Soviet and fascist dictatorships and perhaps the brutal authoritarian control of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages has the content of information been as skillfully and ruthlessly controlled and manipulated. Brands are mistaken for expressions of individuality. Knowledge is confused with how we are made to feel. Propaganda has become a substitute for ideas and ideology. Some more context here. This is from Daniel Boorstin, The Image, published in 1961, which is the very time that these poets are rediscovering the Tang. These very beat poets and literary figures, such as Snyder and others, are rediscovering the power of these Tang poets. Very same time period, Daniel Boorstin, classic study of American media called The Image, simply titled The Image, 1961. Yet now, in the height of our power, in this age of the graphic revolution, we are threatened by a new and peculiarly American menace. It is not the menace of class war, of ideology, of poverty, of disease, of illiteracy, of demagoguery, or of tyranny, though these now plague most of the world. It is the menace of unreality. The threat of nothingness is the danger of replacing American dreams by American illusions, of replacing the ideals by the images, the aspiration by the mold. We risk being the first people in history to have been able to make our illusions so vivid, so persuasive, so realistic that we can live in them. Most illusioned people on earth. Yet we dare not become disillusioned because our illusions are the very house in which we live. They are our news, our heroes, our adventure, our forms of art, our very experience. We have come to believe in our own images till we have projected ourselves out of this world. One of the greatest appeals of this poetry to these poets in a society that was saturated by the one of the first great crests of modern advertising is really just saturating. Well, if you read if you I never watched it, but if you watch Mad Men about advertising in the 20th century, it was set during this very period. Advertising is becoming ubiquitous, and it's simply metastasizing through the culture and colonizing everybody's minds and consciousness in the mid 20th century. To plunge into the world of these poets was to be somewhere completely free of all of this distraction, is to connect to a primal natural world in a way that these poets seem to embody and exemplify in a way that was tremendously powerful for these literary minded 20th century figures. And I would say that is still to this day a powerful part of the appeal, should be a powerful part of the appeal of this poetry. Um, the experience of immersing yourself in this, the I guess the solitude and quiet and peace of a natural environment is gotten at really well in Deer Enclosure. And I'm going to go with, instead of this translation in our textbook, I have an alternate translation by Burton Watson that is preferable, I think. Here, I think this is a better translation. Burton Watson's translation of Deer Enclosure. Empty hills, no one in sight, only the sound of someone talking. Late sunlight enters the deep wood, shining over the green moss again. Now, what Wang Wei is doing here is drawing on his Buddhist sensibility. Burton Watson writes, because the aim of Buddhist teaching is to extinguish passion, to cut man loose from his emotional entanglements. Now think of everything that we've been saying about alienation and the problems of being caught up in the entanglements of the blandishments of a very alienated consumer society, constantly bombarding one with advertisements and so on, constantly um, appealing and prodding one's passions. But the Buddhist teaching is to extinguish passion, to cut man loose from his emotional entanglements. And it must therefore, the poet must choose his words with great circumspection when giving literary expression to the ideals of this Buddhist perspective. Um, More often than not, the Buddhist sought simply to convey in his writing the calmness, detachment, and purity that characterize the enlightened mind. These are precisely the qualities embodied in Wang Wei's poetry. He seems to have carefully excluded from his poems, most of these poems being descriptions of nature or rustic life, but he's excluded from them every element that could be considered wild, dramatic, grandiose, or stirring, all that lies in the heart of the nature poetry of the Western Romantic movement. In Wang Wei, nothing is left of the earlier Chinese attitude of fear or awe in the presence of nature. Instead, he gives the impression of viewing the landscape with perfect Buddhist passivity, not seeking to see anything at all, but merely allowing whatever may lie within the scope of vision to register upon his mind, concealing the care he has taken to create such an impression. He would have us believe that he is a mirror, that favorite symbol in both Taoist and Buddhist literature, a mirror reflecting existence without partiality or prejudice. This poem illustrates that proclivity, I think, in Wang Wei's poetry really well. If you notice that we don't have complete clauses here in Burton Watson's really skillful translation. Watson uses fragments that excise, delete, leave out the subject. We know there's a speaking voice in the poem, of course, but there's no reference to I, to the self. There's no I don't see anybody in the empty hills. That first person pronoun is excised entirely from the four lines. So the subjectivity of the speaker is de-emphasized and occluded, and the focus is entirely out into the natural environment. We hear other people, but we don't see them. And the action of the poem is taken by something as impersonal and really fundamental to the natural world as sunlight. What the sunlight does is, late in the day, it enters the deep wood and it shines over the green moss again. It illuminates the green moss, and it does it again. That again takes tremendous weight in the poem, because you realize that if he's in a forest, there's a canopy of pine boughs or deciduous leaves that prevents the sunlight from reaching the ground and illuminating the moss for most of the day. There's only 2 times in the day when the sun is going to be low enough to shine underneath the canopy of the forest and illuminate the green moss. Early in the morning and then late in the day. And so the consciousness behind this poem, which is only there by implication, and you have to kind of reconstruct it yourself through your own immersion in the poem. But this is a consciousness of someone who's perhaps been meditating in the woods for a good 12 hours. They remember the way in which the moss took on the green illumination of the sunlight in the morning, and it's shining over the green moss again. The intensity of connection and observation, connection to the rhythms and motions of the natural world, and the slowness of those. Even though it would take 12 hours perhaps before the sun comes in again, this is someone who's conscious of what takes place, what has taken place over a period of that many hours. It's shining over the green moss again. What the poem does is convey a tremendously keen sensibility that's profoundly connected to the actual primal real world around the self, and a de-emphasis of the ego and its own tendencies to get entangled in its own appetites and desires. So it's a tremendously, wonderfully Buddhist poem. Well, we've discussed at some length the response to alienation as a flight from the corruptions of an urban, sophisticated, city-based world into nature, taking refuge from that world in nature. With Lipo, we have him drawing on resources from the Taoist tradition And let's look at this passage here. Much Tang poetry tends to treat the world at hand. Libo supplies an additional dimension by describing Taoist worlds beyond the world, evoking moments of history and legend, even transforming everyday occasions into something miraculous. Because of his flair and capacity to see the world with fresh eyes, his contemporaries called him the banished immortal, an ethereal heaven dwelling being exiled for a lifetime in the world of mortals as punishment for some extravagant misdemeanor. Lipo cultivated this reputation by writing poems that tell of encounters with immortals and of cloud climbing excursions through the heavens. So we have a plunge into the fanciful extravagance of subjective fantasy and imagination with Lipo, a particular um, innovation rather than fleeing simply out into nature, although he certainly does that, he also flees into the fanciful visions of his own imagination. He is a visionary poet as well as a nature poet. He's a visionary poet who pursues the visions of his own fanciful and powerfully creative imagination that comes up with idiosyncratic visions derived from the folk tales and lore and legendary of China's own indigenous mystical tradition of Taoism. In a sense, he anticipates what came to be called in the 1800s, under the pressure of the alienation that's impacting bourgeois culture in the 1800s in France. You know, they develop in France in the 1800s what they call the poet moderne, or however it's pronounced in French. I'm not very good at pronouncing French words, but the poet moderne, or the poet, it translates as the cursed poet, but the poet who is idiosyncratic and exiles himself from society. A good example would be Rimbaud, Verlaine, of course, Baudelaire, with the Flowers of Evil. Libo sort of anticipates these sorts of poets of a much later time in the Western tradition with his indulgence in drunkenness, excessive consumption of alcohol as a way to achieve visionary states, to alter his consciousness and achieve visionary states. And this, of course, is going to be very important as well to the mid 20th century beat and counterculture responses to to the alienation pervading US American society in the 20th century. I think a characteristic great little poem by Li Bo is Sitting Alone by Jingting Mountain. And you see his kind of whimsical um, sensibility at play here in the personification of the mountain. The flocks of birds have flown high and away. A solitary cloud goes off calmly alone. We look at each other and never get bored. Just me and Jing Ting Mountain. There's a kind of playful outrageousness there, and the idea of sharing a sort of a staring contest with between a mountain and a person, and never getting bored. Boredom being the great affliction, of course, of surfeited, the surfeited and satiated indolent aristocrats and courtiers down in the city. Boredom was one of the great afflictions of urban life, as it is a great affliction of modernity, modern life. So I think that's a really illustrative word there, boredom. A lot has actually been written about boredom, and what he's saying is, he's in a place in his he's in a state of consciousness here where he's going to never get bored. Not bored at all. Just taking taking pleasure in the company of Jingting Mountain. The sensibility of poems like that is that you're in a place where you see and appreciate things for what they are rather than for what they can be used for or reduced to or um, commodified as. It is a way of connecting with things as they are and looking at them through the eyes of someone who's accepting reality for um, as a kind of companionship rather than as something, the elements of reality around you are elements of companionship rather than things that must be overcome, circumvented, tamed, exploited, used, which is the fundamental impulse of a modern industrialized society. We look at the mountain and we say, what's in there? That we got, we got. Can we mine it for gold? Can we mine it for coal? Can we mine it for copper? What kind of ore is in there? This is the modern sensibility by which mountains are assessed and ascertained, isn't it? They're resources. Let's take them. Let's do mountaintop removal. Let's see what's there. Let's mine it. Let's commodify it. Let's extract. Let's extract what we can from it. The sensibility of our poet here, of Lipo, is to enjoy the mountain as it is. Enjoy it as it is. And that's the power of personifying it. Seeing it intersubjectively as though it's another person. People have a claim to not be used, but to be appreciated as they are. And that's how he's seeing the mountain. Finally, I wanted to include Li Qingshao because she is a woman poet, and it's been an extremely masculinist and male-centered roster of poets and writers in general. It seems, or heroes and so on. We haven't had um, certainly um, we don't have a female poet I know of among the major Tang poets. But if we go forward to the Song period, the Song dynasty, then we have Li Qingshao. And I think she's really, just a few lyrics from her, but I think they're really poignant and moving and wonderful examples of how Tang poetry develops in later centuries in the later Song dynasty. And I think she continues that sense of sensitivity to very wonderful sensitivity to the natural world around her, and she evokes it beautifully. Got to note after note. This last poem we have from her: searching and searching, seeking and seeking, so chill, so clear, dreary and dismal and forlorn. That time of year when it's suddenly warm, then cold again. Now it's hardest of all to take care. 2 or 3 cups of weak wine, how can they resist the biting wind that comes with the evening? Wild geese pass by. That's what hurts the most. And yet they're old acquaintances. In piles, chrysanthemums fill the ground, looking old, wasted, damaged. Who could pick them as they are now? I stay by the window. How can I wait alone until blackness comes? The beech tree, on top of that, the fine rain, on until dusk, the dripping drop after drop. In a situation like this, how can that one word sorrow grasp it? I think these poems are wonderful for the way that they put you in a time machine and take you back. You see, she doesn't have her iPhone to pop out of her pocket and scroll through her whatever, her feeds, her text messages, and she can't even turn on the TV, right? She stays by the window. She's alone. The only show is this natural world, the world out there of nature, but she evokes it with such power that it doesn't matter at the end. Ironically enough, it doesn't matter if the word sorrow cannot grasp the landscape of her interior feelings and emotional life, because what she's done is use the external world by representation of powerful images of the external world around her. She has painted a powerful portrait of her emotional landscape inside. We don't need the word sorrow. We have far more poignant and powerful evocation of her subjective feelings through the indelible images that she gives us in these lines of poetry. Once again, sensibility that is intimately connected to the world around her, seeing it as it is, sharp observation, keenly observant. It's a kind of way of seeing the world that's hard for modern people to get, and the people that really brought this poetry to a wide audience in the mid 20th century realized that. They realized the sense in which this poetry acted as a kind of tonic to the sensibility. Last thing I'll do, because I know I'm coming up on an hour and 15 minutes here. Last thing I'll do is just call attention to this document in week 5 called Chinese Poetry, Eric Fromm excerpt. I read some Eric Fromm in this lecture, but what this is from an excerpt from To Have or to Be, where he frames a discussion of poetry, and he has some Basho, Japanese haiku master poet, discussed in here. And I think it's a really instructive um, passage, and really instructive piece about poetry. And a lot of what he says about Basho's poem transfers to these Chinese poets as well. And I think his distinction he makes between having and being here relates a lot to the critique of alienation that was made in this lecture. Basically, being mode is unalienated. Having mode is the mode of alienation that is so common in our modern world. And what he's advocating for from is in this passage is the experience of being rather than having. And he presents the Japanese poet Basho as a vehicle expressing the sense of being, in contradistinction to Alfred Lord Tennyson. It's an interesting passage. So I think it complements this lecture well. And with that parting observation, I will end this lecture.